The classical arithmetic, we are always told, was first liberated from its sense bondage, widened and extended by Diaphantus, who did not indeed create algebra, the science of undefined magnitudes, but brought it to expression within the framework of the classical mathematic that we know, and so suddenly that we have to assume that there was a pre-existent stock of ideas which he worked out. But this amounts not to an enrichment of, but a complete victory over the classical world feeling. And the mere fact should have been sufficed in itself to show that, inwardly, Diaphantus does not belong to the classical culture at all. What is active in him is a new number feeling, or let us say, a new limit feeling with respect to the actual and become, and no longer that Hellenic feeling of sensuously present limits, which had produced the Euclidean geometry, the nude statue, and the coin. Details of the formation of this new mathematic we do not know. Diaphantus stands so completely by himself in the history of so-called late classical mathematics that an Indian influence has been presumed. But here also the influence it must really have been that of the early Arabian schools whose studies, apart from the dogmatic, have hitherto been so imperfectly investigated. In Diaphantus, unconscious though he may be of his own essential antagonism to the classical foundations on which he intended to build, there emerges from under the surface of Euclidean intention the new limit feeling which I designate the Magian. He did not widen the idea of number as magnitude, but, unwittingly, eliminated it. No Greek could have stated anything about an undefined number a, or an undenominated number 3, which are neither magnitudes nor lines, whereas the new limit feeling sensibly expressed by numbers of this sort at least underlay, if it did not constitute, Diophantine treatment. And the letter notation which we employ to clothe our own, again transvalued, algebra, was first introduced by VII in 1591, an unmistakable, if unintended, protest against the classicizing tendency of Renaissance mathematics. Diaphantus lived about 250 A.D., that is, in the 3rd century of that Arabian culture whose organic history, till now smothered under the surface forms of the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages, comprises everything that happened after the beginning of our era in the region that was later to be Islam's. It was precisely in the time of Diaphantus that the last shadow of the Attic statuary art paled before the new space sense of cupola, mosaic, and sarcophagus relief that we have in the early Christian Syrian style. In that time there was once more archaic art, and strictly geometrical ornament, and at that time too Diocletian completed the transformation of the now merely sham empire into a caliphate. The 4 centuries that separate Euclid and Diaphantus separate also Plato and Plotinus, the last and conclusive thinker, the Kant, of a fulfilled culture, and the first schoolman, the Duns Scotus, of a culture just awakened. It is here that we are made aware for the first time of the existence of those higher individualities whose coming, growth, and decay constitute the real substance of history underlying the myriad colors and changes of the surface. The classical spirituality, which reached its final phase in the cold intelligence of the Romans, and of which the whole classical culture with all its works, thoughts, deeds, and ruins forms the body, had been born about 1100 BC in the country about the Aegean Sea. The Arabian culture, which under the cover of classical civilization had been germinating in the East since Augustus, came wholly out of the region between Armenia and southern Arabia, Alexandria and Ctesiphon, and we have to consider as expressions of this new soul almost the whole late classical art of the empire. All the young, ardent religions of the East, Mandaeanism, Manichaeanism, Christianity, Neoplatonism, and in Rome itself, as well as the imperial fora, that pantheon which is the first of all mosques. That Alexandria and Antioch still wrote in Greek and imagined that they were thinking in Greek is a fact of no more importance than the facts that Latin was the scientific language of the West right up to the time of Kant, and that Charlemagne renewed the Roman Empire. In Diaphantus, number has ceased to be the measure and essence of plastic things. In the Ravenette mosaics, man has ceased to be a body. Unnoticed, Greek designations have lost their original connotations. We have left the realm of Attic kalogegathia, the Stoic arapaxia, and Galeni. Diaphantus does not yet know 0 and negative numbers, it is true, but he has ceased to know Pythagorean numbers. And this Arabian indeterminateness of number is, in its turn, something quite different from the controlled variability of the later Western mathematics, the variability of the function. The Magian mathematic, we can see the outline, though we are ignorant of the details, advanced through Diaphantus, who is obviously not a starting point, boldly and logically to a culmination in the Abbasid period, 9th century, that we can appreciate in Al-Khwarizmi and Al-Sidshi. And as Euclidean geometry is to Attic statuary, the same expression form in a different medium, and the analysis of space to polyphonic music, so this algebra is to the Magian art with its mosaic, its arabesque, which the Sassanid Empire and later Byzantium produced with an ever-increasing profusion and luxury of tangible and intangible organic motives, and its Constantinian high relief in which uncertain deep darks divide the freely handled figures of the foreground. As algebra is to classical arithmetic and Western analysis, so is the Cupola Church to the Doric Temple and the Gothic Cathedral. It is not as though Diaphantus were one of the great mathematicians. On the contrary, much of what we have been accustomed to associate with his name is not his work alone. His accidental importance lies in the fact that, so far as our knowledge goes, he was the first mathematician in whom the new number feeling is unmistakably present. In comparison with the masters who conclude the development of a mathematic, with Apollonius and Archimedes, with Gauss, Cauchy, Riemann, Diaphantus has, in his form language especially, something primitive. This something, which till now we have been pleased to refer to late classical decadence, we shall presently learn to understand and value, just as we are revising our ideas as to the despised late classical art, and beginning to see it in the tentative expression of the nascent early Arabian culture. Similarly archaic, primitive, and groping was the mathematic of Nicolas Oresme, Bishop of Lisieux, 1323 to 1382, who was the first Western who used coordinates, so to say, elastically, and more important still, to employ fractional powers, both of which presuppose a number feeling, obscure it may be, but quite unmistakable, which is completely non-classical and also non-Arabic. But if, further, we think of Diaphantus together with the early Christian sarcophagi of the Roman collections, and of Oresme, together with the Gothic wall statuary of the German cathedrals, we see that the mathematicians as well as the artists have something in common, which is that they stand in their respective cultures at the same, viz. The primitive, level of abstract understanding. In the world and age of Diaphantus, the stereometric sense of bounds, which had long ago reached in Archimedes the late stages of refinement and elegance proper to the megalopolitan intelligence, had passed away. Throughout that world, men were unclear, longing, mystic, and no longer bright and free in the Attic way. They were men rooted in the earth of a young countryside, not megalopolitans like Euclid and D'Alembert. They no longer understood the deep and complicated forms of the classical thought, and their own were confused and new, far as yet from urban clarity and tidiness. Their culture was in the Gothic condition, as all cultures have been in their youth, as even the classical was in the early Doric period, which is known to us now only by its dipylon pottery. Only in Baghdad and in the 9th and 10th centuries were the young ideas of the age of Diaphantus carried through to completion by ripe masters of the caliber of Plato and Gauss.